from natural disasters. So it makes no sense.
Nowitzki believes that these unlikely and inhospitable heights are a place of last resort, a defensible refuge designed to offer protection not from nature, but from a human enemy.
I mean, there is no reason to live on the ledges, hanging above the gorge or on the rocky knolls, other than a real threat from some other people.
If Nowitzki's theory about the Aegean Apocalypse is correct, there should be dozens of refuge sites waiting to be discovered in the high mountains of Crete, hidden settlements unseen for generations. If he can find them, they could reveal details of a life and death struggle between the survivors who subsisted at these impossible heights and the enemy that drove them there. There are many theories as to what could have caused the apocalypse of 1200 BC and destroyed the mighty Bronze Age civilizations of the Hittites, Canaanites, Mycenaean, and Minoans. Some have blamed natural disasters, disease and pestilence, even the wrath of an angry god. But could it have had a human cause? And if so, who were the people that sent such mighty cultures crashing down within the span of a single generation? For decades, archaeologists sifted the abundant ruins but found only a few isolated clues. Then, in the 1930s, a stone tablet bearing a desperate message was unearthed in northern Syria. Found in the ruins of the palace of Ugarit, destroyed by fire around 1200 BC, it gave a foretaste of the destruction to come.
The king of Ugarit says, "My father, 7 enemy ships have been sighted. Now they've already done great damage to my country. If you see any more, please let me know." The tablet was never sent. It was found in the kiln, ready to be fired, when obviously the enemy ships came back and destroyed the town.
Who was this enemy that came from the sea? Only one culture, Egypt, survived the collapse of the Bronze Age to give them a name. Ancient hieroglyphics tell of a terrifying foe, the warriors known only as the Sea Peoples.
We get all of our details about what the Sea Peoples look like and their mode of transportation from the Egyptians. In addition to the texts that the Egyptians put up on their walls, they also put up pictorial scenes. And so they actually show us what the Sea Peoples look like. We can see the type of helmets they wear, the type of headdresses they wear. We can see them moving in ox carts, in some cases with their families, wives and children and possessions.
This was a mass movement that was affecting all the ancient cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean. And this was something that had never happened before. Every single culture in that area, even the ones as well established and as powerful as Egyptians, were being really shaken by this movement of the Sea People. Because part of it is they were coming not only to attack, but to settle.
This is what archaeologist Krzysztof Nowitzki had envisioned when he first looked at the ruins high on Carfi, a desperate people, the shepherds and farmers of the valleys driven into the mountains they knew so well. But could he prove that Carfi was no anomaly, simply one example in the systematic evacuation of an entire people? Nowitzki has spent more than 20 years putting his theory to the test. Traveling alone, and with only the most minimal of supplies, he methodically scaled mountain tops so steep that he often had to cling to the cliff face or find ancient footholds carved into the rock to counter the treacherous, shifting beds of loose shale. And it is here, at these improbable heights, that he found what has been his greatest discovery, the mountaintop settlement of Katalimata. The site can only be reached by ascending an incline of loose stone, then clinging to an almost invisible path along the cliff face. In 1990, American archaeologist Donald Haggis accompanied him as a witness.
This one is extraordinary. The site itself is built on these sharply formed precipitous limestone cliffs above the plain, and you have to get to it by climbing a scree slope and then entering the gorge from the outer face by a narrow entrance path.
The artifacts found at the site reveal a people living on the edge. These simple country inlanders, shepherds and farmers by trade, would have had to move all their possessions one by one up these steep mountain trails. The old and the infirm would have had to have been carried, their dead buried in tombs carved out of the mountaintops. Livestock and crops in the valleys below could only be tended when conditions were safe enough.
The evidence that we recovered during surveys suggests that they were using the settlement probably for a considerable period. It's an uncomfortable site to live in. It's not conducive to settlement expansion.
Though life on Katalymata would have been extremely difficult, it had one advantage: security.
This place it can be a nightmare for strangers, for foreigners. Without this knowledge of local topography, it's really very difficult to climb them and to find them.
They're like fortresses, in a sense, utilizing the natural terrain, and sometimes, as a lot of research out here is showing, not just utilizing the terrain, but utilizing fairly effective fortification walls as well.
Any enemy trying to invade the settlement would have been visible for miles, allowing the mountain people time to prepare. The invaders themselves would have been forced to approach single file, unable to hold their weapons while clinging to the cliff face.
Even if they found a way, then it was very easy to stop them. Even a few men could stop a much stronger group of intruders, of enemies here on these narrow ledges.
Katalymata was only the first of many refuge sites that Nowitzki has discovered. After scaling nearly 2,000 mountains in Crete, he has identified 80 different refuge sites dating to 1200 BC. One common unifying factor in the orientation and design of these settlements has convinced him that they were built to withstand the sea peoples.
How do we know that these people were afraid of the people coming from the sea and not that they were afraid of their neighbors? This can be done only by analyzing how these settlements were defended. Carfi is completely open from the area of the mountains behind it. So we know that they didn't expect the enemy coming from these mountains. These places were settled because they were afraid of the people coming from the sea.
The influx of these sea peoples was to change the face of the ancient world. So who exactly were they? In a memorial carved at Medinet Habu, the Egyptians identify 9 factions of sea peoples, a list that baffles linguists.
Most of the theories about where the sea peoples came from are dependent on the philology, the actual names of their groups, and that can be very dangerous territory. The Shekelesh are frequently said to be from Sicily. Did they come from Sicily, or did they go to Sicily after they lost?
For decades, scholars have argued over the origin of the sea peoples. Some point to southeastern Turkey, northern Syria, and the eastern Mediterranean as a likely launch point. Others contend that the sea peoples most likely came from Sicily, Sardinia, Italy, and the western and central Mediterranean.
Do the sea peoples come from the east and move west, or do they come from the west and move east? We don't know.
Were these really 9 nations of foreign invaders? Or was this an attack that started much closer to home? One theory holds that it was the very structure of the ancient world that made it vulnerable to terrorism from within, a world built around palaces and omnipotent kings.
The king would control most everything. There would be some private merchants and private enterprise, but mostly the king runs the government, the king runs the army, the king is going to run the international trade, certainly in charge of the diplomatic powers. So you're in a situation where the palace pretty much controls 75 to 90% of daily life.
In many places, it seems the kings and queens lived with the gods. The kings and queens were the human representatives of the deities. These deities are statues. And then there is the army, the professional army, under the kings and queens. And then there's everybody else. And everybody else was supposed to keep and wanted to keep the gods and the kings and queens satisfied.
The only place for laborers and peasants outside this system was in the king's massive armies. And even there, they played a subservient role in the service of the charioteers.
The typical battle in the late Bronze Age seems to have been the charge of two chariotries against each other. Each chariotry might be numbered in the hundreds or possibly the thousands. And the chariot crew was heavily armored, and that was the main weapon, the composite bow. And so the fighting was mostly at long range. But of course, after they'd hit a target and brought an opposing chariot to a stop, then somebody had to go and finish off that crew. And that's where the so-called runners came in, the barbarians who were hired to act as cleanup crews in a chariot battle.
These anonymous groups of hired mercenaries were recruited from the poorest parts of the ancient world.
The tablets that we have make it very clear that the palaces took very good care of the charioteers. They knew every charioteer by name, and these people seem to have been an elite. The runners seem to have been counted rather than named. They have so many hired from here and hired from there. There was a real difference in the social class of these people.
As long as there was conflict, there was a place for these foot soldiers. But in the years leading up to the Great Collapse, there was an unprecedented period of peace.
The country was more or less at peace because of the great treaty between the Hittites and Ramses II.
It would be the equivalent of after World War I or after World War II, with the various powers signing a peace treaty. This effectively brought an end to warfare between two of the greatest powers of the day, and we get half a century or so of peace. It certainly was one of the true high points of the ancient world. And then it all comes crashing down.
Did the fact that there was little employment for these lower-class runners lead to an uprising? Or were these out-of-work warriors recruited by an outside enemy?
And these warriors, now without the central authority, were either on their own or they were under the supervision of these local chieftains. They could do whatever they wanted. Nobody could catch them.
The Egyptian record suggests it was a changing coalition that raided the power centers of the ancient world for over 50 years.
We've got indications in the Egyptian records themselves that there were successive waves of sea peoples. Almost certainly there's a change in the makeup of the group between the first and the second invasion. They're definitely working together as a coalition, but I don't think that they began that way. What we're seeing is the end result. It's the final wave that's washing up against Egypt.
And as the Egyptian reliefs show, the so-called sea peoples were armed in much the same way as the native chariot runners.
They were not heavily armored. In fact, any kind of armor would have